They expected fences, drills, and long days under the Texas sun, but nothing prepared them for the afternoon. The truck stopped near a dusty arena filled with cheering civilians, horses circling at full speed, and men in wide hats riding bulls as if war did not exist at all. And as the German prisoners were guided to wooden bleachers among families and children, watching the spectacle unfold beneath a vast western sky, many of them could not immediately understand whether they were witnessing a public festival, a cultural ritual, or something arranged deliberately for them, because in that moment, surrounded by applause and swirling dust, it felt less like captivity and more like stepping into another world entirely. The road leading to the arena stretched across flat Texas land, dry and pale beneath the afternoon sun. The prisoners had been told only that they were being transported for a temporary work detail near town. Nothing in the instructions suggested spectacle or celebration. The trucks moved steadily past open fields, scattered farmhouses, and long wooden fences until the distant outline of grandstands began to appear against the horizon. As they approached, the sound reached them first. It was not the ordered rhythm of military command, nor the metallic clatter of camp routine. It was layered noise, cheers rising and falling, bursts of applause, the faint echo of an announcer's voice carried by loudspeakers. The prisoners exchanged brief glances, uncertain whether they had misunderstood their destination. This did not resemble a work site. When the vehicle stopped, dust lifted around the wheels and drifted slowly back to the ground. Guards directed them calmly toward a side entrance where wooden planks formed a passage along the perimeter of a wide, circular arena. The scent of earth and livestock mixed in the air. Horses stamped behind a fence nearby, restless yet controlled. The prisoners stepped forward carefully, absorbing the unfamiliar scene. Inside the arena, riders moved in practiced arcs across the dirt floor. One man, wearing a broad hat and fitted shirt, guided his horse with sharp precision, turning tightly around barrels placed at intervals. Another participant prepared near a gate, adjusting his stance before the latch was lifted and a bull charged forward into open space. The crowd responded instantly, voices rising with excitement. The prisoners were seated along one side of the grandstand, not isolated, but integrated among ordinary spectators. Families sat beside them without visible tension. Children leaned forward eagerly, pointing toward the action below. Vendors passed through the rows carrying refreshments. The atmosphere felt festive rather than guarded. For men accustomed to strict boundaries and predictable schedules, the openness of the event felt disorienting. No one spoke directly to them at first, yet no one recoiled either. They were present in plain view, uniforms marking their status clearly, yet the attention of the crowd remained fixed on the riders below. The spectacle itself dominated the space. Dust rose each time hooves struck the ground, forming brief clouds that shimmered in the sunlight before settling again. The arena functioned as a contained world where skill and timing determined outcome. Riders anticipated the movements of powerful animals, adjusting posture and grip with precision. Each successful ride triggered applause, while abrupt falls drew collective gasps followed by relief when the rider regained footing. The prisoners observed how the event unfolded according to rules understood by those around them. Announcements were made, scores calculated, and participants recognized. It was not chaos. It was structured competition embedded within celebration. The rhythm of the rodeo followed its own logic, independent of military routine. What unsettled some of the men was not the spectacle itself, but the context in which they were witnessing it. They remained prisoners of war, transported under guard, yet seated among civilians at a public event. The contrast between confinement and communal festivity created a quiet tension in their thoughts. As the afternoon progressed, the sun shifted slightly westward, casting longer shadows across the arena floor. The cheering continued steadily, and the riders prepared for subsequent rounds. The prisoners sat watching, absorbing each detail, aware that this experience did not align with their expectations of captivity. In that Texas arena, surrounded by dust, applause, and controlled displays of risk, they confronted once again the unfamiliar reality of their circumstances in America. Captivity remained intact, yet for several hours, they were positioned not behind wire, but within a public celebration that reflected a different culture's rhythm, confidence, and spectacle. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the first round of riders concluded, the rhythm of the arena did not slow. A brief pause allowed workers to smooth the dirt and reset the gates, yet the crowd remained animated, conversations overlapping with anticipation. The prisoners observed how seamlessly the event continued, each segment flowing into the next without confusion. It was not a spontaneous gathering, but a carefully organized tradition. From their seats, they could see the preparation behind the wooden barriers. Riders adjusted saddles, tightened straps, and exchanged brief words with assistants. The animals were guided calmly into position, their strength contained through practiced handling rather than force. The entire scene conveyed familiarity. Those participating were not improvising. They were performing within a system refined over time. One of the prisoners noted how the announcer addressed the audience in a confident tone, narrating the action and introducing competitors by name. The spectators responded not merely to danger, but to skill. Applause followed precise maneuvers, and murmurs rose when a rider lost balance too quickly. The arena operated as a shared space of expectation where outcome mattered, yet risk was understood and managed. What struck the prisoners most was the absence of hostility directed toward them. Their presence did not provoke reaction beyond occasional glances. They were visible, clearly identifiable as captives, yet the attention of those around them remained focused on the spectacle. The rodeo, not the war, commanded the moment. A child seated nearby asked his father a question, gesturing toward the prisoners with mild curiosity. The father responded briefly, then returned his gaze to the arena. There was no visible alarm, no effort to create distance. The normalcy of the interaction unsettled some of the men more than open suspicion might have. They were not treated as threats in that setting. They were simply present. The next event involved a rider attempting to remain mounted on a powerful bull released suddenly from confinement. The animal surged forward, twisting sharply, while the rider struggled to maintain control. Dust erupted beneath them, and the crowd reacted in unison, voices rising with tension. When the rider was thrown clear and quickly assisted to his feet, relief spread visibly through the grandstand. The prisoners watched with analytical attention. The spectacle centered on calculated confrontation between human precision and animal force. It was dramatic, yet governed by rules. Medical staff stood ready nearby, prepared for injury. The arena balanced risk with structure. As the afternoon advanced, refreshments were distributed among spectators. Vendors moved through the aisles with trays and containers. The prisoners observed how easily commerce intertwined with celebration. The event was not solely about competition, it was also social, communal, embedded in regional identity. For men transported from guarded barracks to open bleachers, the experience blurred boundaries. They remained under supervision, yet for several hours they shared space with civilians engaged in leisure. The war felt distant within that arena, not absent, but suspended behind layers of dust and applause. When another rider completed a flawless run around the barrels, earning sustained cheering, the prisoners felt the weight of contrast once more. Inside the camp, routine was defined by restriction and predictability. Here, energy flowed outward through performance and celebration. The sun dipped slightly lower, casting warmer tones across the wooden stands. The rodeo continued with steady cadence, each segment reinforcing the sense that this was not an exception but a recurring event deeply rooted in the region. Seated among strangers who neither feared nor confronted them, the prisoners understood that they were witnessing more than entertainment. They were observing a cultural ritual unfolding without interruption, even in wartime. And in that structured display of skill, risk, and communal enthusiasm, they encountered once again the unfamiliar texture of American civilian life beyond the wire. As the rodeo moved into its later events, the atmosphere shifted subtly from anticipation to immersion. The prisoners, who had initially watched with measured detachment, now found themselves studying not only the riders but the spectators around them. Couples leaned toward one another to comment on performances. Elderly men nodded with quiet approval at skilled maneuvers. Teenagers laughed easily when a rider lost balance too soon. The arena functioned as a shared space of memory and identity, not merely spectacle. The prisoners began to notice how deeply the event was woven into local culture. Flags fluttered above the grandstand, and between competitions, the announcer spoke briefly about tradition, livestock, and regional pride. The words were carried by loudspeakers across the open field, steady and assured. This was not organized for novelty. It belonged here. One rider entered the arena wearing a simple expression of concentration rather than bravado. His horse responded to slight shifts of weight and rein, accelerating smoothly before executing tight turns that sent dust spiraling outward. The crowd's reaction was immediate but controlled. Applause built gradually, respectful of precision. It was not chaos but acknowledgement. For the prisoners, accustomed to rigid formations and commands, the spontaneity of civilian enthusiasm felt unfamiliar. Yet it was not disorderly. The rodeo adhered to timing, rules, and scoring. Judges stood at measured distances, recording outcomes with focused attention. Order existed, but it was shaped by competition rather than authority. A brief intermission allowed livestock to be repositioned and the arena floor to be leveled once more. During this pause, a local band played from a raised platform near the entrance. The music was lively yet unhurried, blending into the open air. Children wandered short distances under parental supervision. Vendors continued their quiet circulation. The prisoners reflected inwardly on the contrast between this open celebration and the structured isolation of camp life. Inside the wire, movement was regulated and purpose defined by routine. Here, movement followed curiosity and leisure. No one directed the crowd where to sit or how to react. Participation was voluntary, guided by shared understanding. What unsettled some of the men was not the entertainment itself, but the realization that such gatherings continued uninterrupted despite global conflict. War had not erased local ritual. It existed parallel to it. The rodeo demonstrated that civilian life retained its rhythms even as distant fronts shifted. As another rider prepared to attempt a longer, more difficult run, silence briefly settled across the grandstand. The crowd leaned forward collectively. The gate opened, and the riders surged into motion. Dust rose sharply as hooves struck the ground in rapid succession. When the final turn was executed with flawless control, applause erupted in sustained waves. The prisoners remained seated, observing carefully. They were present within a moment of communal triumph that did not revolve around them. No announcement referenced their status. No speech invoked the war. The event stood independent, anchored in place and tradition. By the time shadows lengthened across the arena, the men understood that they had not been brought there for spectacle aimed at them. They were witnesses to something ongoing, part of the landscape rather than its focus. The realization carried quiet weight. For several hours, captivity had intersected with culture without tension. As the final event approached, the crowd's energy remained steady. The prisoners sat in thoughtful silence, aware that this experience would linger in memory not for its noise, but for its normalcy. In that Texas arena, surrounded by dust, music, and measured competition, they had glimpsed how a community sustained identity even during wartime. continuing its rituals under an open sky while the conflict remained distant beyond the horizon. As the afternoon wore on and the sun lowered toward the horizon, the light inside the arena shifted from harsh brightness to a warmer glow that softened the dust in the air. The energy of the crowd did not fade, yet it matured into a steadier rhythm. Applause came more measured, conversations quieter between events. The prisoners, seated among families who had long since accepted their presence, began to feel the weight of contrast more sharply than before. Inside the camp, time was divided into segments of obligation: roll call, meals, work assignments, inspection. Each hour carried defined purpose. Here, time expanded and contracted according to enjoyment. There was no visible urgency, no whistle signaling transition. The event unfolded at its own pace, guided by tradition rather than command. During one of the final competitions, a young rider prepared at the gate, visibly smaller in stature than those who had entered before him. The announcer's voice took on a slightly different tone, describing him as a newcomer testing his skill. The crowd responded not with skepticism, but encouragement. When the gate opened and the horse surged forward, the rider maintained balance through sharp turns and tight control, completing the course cleanly. The applause that followed carried approval not just for skill, but for effort. The prisoners observed how risk and reward were publicly acknowledged. Success was celebrated openly, and failure, when it occurred, was met with concern rather than ridicule. Riders who fell were assisted quickly, their safety prioritized before competition resumed. The arena balanced danger with care, intensity with structure. What unsettled several of the men was the openness of it all. They remained clearly identifiable as prisoners, escorted under supervision, yet they were not segregated behind barriers or hidden from view. The guards stood at measured distances, attentive but unobtrusive. The civilians did not stare continuously. They accepted the shared space without dramatizing it. A small boy seated 2 rows ahead turned briefly to glance at the prisoners again, curiosity in his expression rather than fear. He whispered something to his mother, who responded calmly and returned her attention to the arena. The simplicity of the exchange lingered in the prisoners' minds. There was no hostility in it, no spectacle made of their presence. As the final rounds concluded, the announcer summarized scores and recognized top performers. Riders removed their hats in brief acknowledgement, nodding toward the stands. The crowd responded with one last swell of applause before gradually rising to leave. Dust settled slowly back onto the arena floor as footsteps echoed along wooden planks. The prisoners were guided back toward the trucks without haste. The air felt cooler now, tinged with evening calm. Behind them, the arena remained intact, already preparing for the next gathering. Nothing about the event suggested that it had been staged or altered because of their attendance. During the drive back across open land, the men sat quietly, reflecting on what they had witnessed. The rodeo had not erased the reality of war, nor had it diminished their confinement. Yet it had revealed a civilian rhythm that persisted confidently. Tradition continued. Celebration endured. Community gathered beneath open sky without interruption. As the camp's perimeter came back into view, fences and watchtowers reasserted their presence. The shift from arena to enclosure was immediate and unmistakable. Still, the memory of dust, applause, and riders beneath the Texas sun remained vivid. For several hours, they had observed a culture expressing itself freely, unaffected by their status. Inside the wire once more, the contrast felt sharper than before. The rodeo had not been a performance for them. It had been a continuation of something deeply rooted, unfolding regardless of war. And in witnessing that continuity, the prisoners understood that the world beyond the fence carried its own steady pulse, moving forward under a wide and indifferent sky. Back inside the camp, the ordinary sounds of confinement resumed with familiar precision: boots on gravel, metal gates closing, voices calling names for evening roll. The transition from open arena to enclosed compound was immediate, yet the atmosphere among the men carried a subtle difference. They were quieter than usual, not from exhaustion, but from reflection. The afternoon beneath the Texas sky lingered in their thoughts with unexpected clarity. In the barracks that evening, conversation unfolded gradually. Some spoke about the rider's control over powerful animals, noting how technique and discipline determined outcome more than brute strength. Others commented on the confidence of the crowd, the ease with which families had gathered in large numbers without visible tension. The event had not been staged as spectacle for outsiders. It had been routine, repeated, embedded in local rhythm. One of the older prisoners remarked that what unsettled him most was not the entertainment itself, but the absence of fear. No one in the grandstand had appeared preoccupied with threat. There were no sirens, no blacked-out windows, no hurried dispersal at the sound of aircraft. The rodeo had unfolded beneath open sky as if war were a distant rumor rather than a global conflict. That confidence was difficult to reconcile with their own experience of displacement and uncertainty. Another reflected on the presence of children seated only a few rows away. Their laughter had been directed at clumsy rides and playful commentary, not at the prisoners themselves. The simplicity of that interaction lingered. The civilians had not treated them as spectacle. They had simply shared space for a few hours within the same wooden stands. As night settled outside the barracks, the men considered how tradition can persist even in turbulent times. The rodeo represented more than competition. It was ritual, community, continuity. Horses, dust, music, and applause formed part of a regional identity that continued uninterrupted. War existed beyond the horizon, yet local life sustained its patterns. Inside the camp, routine resumed unchanged. Meals were distributed, lights dimmed at designated hour. Guards continued patrol along the fence line. Nothing about their status had shifted, yet perspective had expanded. The afternoon in the arena had revealed a civilian world operating according to its own calendar, confident enough to gather publicly and celebrate skill under bright sunlight. Several men lay awake longer than usual, replaying the image of riders circling the dirt floor while the crowd rose in applause. They understood now that they had not been brought there for display. They had been incidental observers to an ongoing tradition. The realization carried quiet weight. It suggested that beyond the wire, life retained layers of normalcy unaffected by their confinement. In that recognition, the rodeo became more than an event. It symbolized continuity. It demonstrated how communities maintain identity even as war reshapes distant fronts. And for the prisoners who had sat among families beneath a wide Texas sky, the memory of dust and cheering remained as a reminder that the world beyond captivity moved forward in rhythms both ordinary and enduring. In the end, the rodeo did not alter the fence line or the daily roll call, yet it left a mark far deeper than a simple afternoon outing. For a few hours beneath the wide Texas sky, the prisoners had stepped into a space defined not by confinement, but by tradition, competition, and communal pride. They had watched riders test skill against strength, listened to applause rise and fall like steady waves, and observed families gather without visible fear. What unsettled them most was not the dust or the spectacle, but the continuity. The war had not halted the rhythm of local life. The arena gates opened on schedule. The announcer's voice carried across the stands. Children laughed. Vendors walked the aisles. Tradition continued, steady and unbroken. Inside the camp, routine was imposed. Outside, routine was chosen. That distinction lingered in their thoughts long after they returned to the barracks. The rodeo had not been staged for them. It had been simply another day in a community confident enough to celebrate under open sky while conflict unfolded far away. The fences still stood firm, and the guards maintained their watch. Yet beyond those boundaries, dust still rose from hooves. Music still drifted across wooden bleachers, and applause still echoed against evening light. The prisoners understood that they had witnessed not a gesture of spectacle, but the endurance of civilian identity in wartime. Years later, when memory softened the sharp edges of confinement, some might recall not only the gates and gravel paths, but also the image of riders circling an arena beneath a vast horizon. In that moment, they had seen how a culture carries its rituals forward regardless of distant battles, sustaining rhythm and pride even when the world beyond trembles. And in that Texas arena, seated among strangers who neither feared nor confronted them, the prisoners glimpsed something unexpected, that beyond captivity, life moved with steady confidence, continuing its traditions beneath a sky wide enough to hold both war and celebration at the same time. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.